All right, let's proceed. So now we're going to talk about the electromagnetic spectrum. So, we have the term electromagnetic waves, right? So, waves. Ano ba itong mga electromagnetic waves? So, based on the book, electromagnetic waves are signals that oscillate, right? These are signals that oscillate. The amplitude of the electric and magnetic fields vary at a specific rate. Okay, nagbabago yung kaniyang ng amplitude ng kanyang electric and magnetic fields. Okay? So, lahat ng electrical and electronic signals that radiate into free space, so lahat ng signals na yung channel niya ay free space or na nandun sa free space, right? Nandun sa free space, all electronic and electrical signals na nandun sa free space fall into electromagnetic spectrum. Of course, hindi kasali yung ating mga signals na nasa cable kasi nga we're talking about signals na nasa free space, okay? So lahat ng signals na nasa free space falls into our electromagnetic spectrum. So ano ba itong electromagnetic spectrum? Eto na yun. Ito ang itsura ng ating electromagnetic spectrum. So makikita dito yung range ng ating frequency. So we have here 30 Hz to 300 Hz. That is ELF. Ano ba itong ELF? That means, ayan, extremely low frequency. Okay, may ibig sabihin yan sila. Lahat ng signal that falls in between 300 to 3,000 3 kilohertz is VF. Okay? So, ito yun. Ito yung electromagnetic spectrum. Ulitin ko, ha? So, ito, range, ito ng mga frequency. These are frequency range. Okay? Frequency ng ano? Ng mga signals that radiate into free space. So, lahat, all electrical and electronic signals na that radiate into free space, they either fall into this category. Okay? So, hindi kasali yung mga nasa wires or nasa cables. Although those have frequency, pero kapag wala siya sa free space, it doesn't matter. Okay? Yung focus natin is andun sa free space. So, the range of electromagnetic signals encompassing all frequency is referred to the electromagnetic spectrum. So, andun lahat yung range ng ating electromagnetic signals. No? Range ng ano? Ng frequency. Ito. So, andito lahat ng range. So, starting from 30 Hz pataas. Okay? So, aside sa range, of course, nakikita din natin dito yung wavelength ng ating signal. Okay, indicated on your electromagnetic spectrum is the wavelength of your signal, the frequency, and of course, yung kaniyang pangalan. Na example lang ha. So, we know that yung mga X-rays, gamma rays, cosmic rays, they travel through space. Tama ba? Yeah, they travel through space. So, andito sila. So, kasali sila sa ating electromagnetic spectrum. They fall into this part of electromagnetic spectrum. Yung ultraviolet rays from the sun, di ba they travel through free space? Ayan. Meron yung frequency. So, andito sila na fall. They fall into this category. Yung mga visible light natin, nakikita natin, they also fall into this category. Okay? So, for example, tumawag ka sa sa friend mo through cellphone. That is wireless, tama ba? So, malamang yung signal nyo, they radiate into free space. So, somehow, andito din yun siya. Okay? Na-fall siya dito. Yung sa mga FM radio station, mga FM. Okay? So, they also radiate into free space. So, somehow, andito din yon. So, my point is, yung electromagnetic spectrum, andito lahat ng ating range ng frequencies, okay, frequency ng ating mga electrical and electronic signals that radiates into free space. I want you to memorize that. Alright? Okay, so since na-mention dito yung ating frequency and yung ating wavelength, let's talk a little bit about that. So frequency and wavelength. So let's start with frequency. So a signal is located on the frequency spectrum according to its frequency and the wavelength, of course. Frequency, pag sabi mong frequency, it is the number of cycles of a repetitive wave that occur on a given period of time. A cycle consists of two voltage polarity reversals, current reversals, or electromagnetic field oscillations, and the frequency is measured in terms of cycles per second. Familiar cycles per second, or it is called hertz. So to give you a better idea, let's take a look at this. Say for example, this signal. So this is sinusoidal. This is one waveform. Tama ba? Sinusoidal is paulit-ulit na ganito yung pattern. Tama ba? Kaya tawag natin sa kanya periodic. Okay. Now, say for example, at this period of time, same sila, di ba? So, itong first signal natin, we have one pattern ng ating sinusoid. Okay? This is on this amount of time. Sa baba, same amount of time, pero ilang pattern yung nabuo mo? 1, 2. So, you have two patterns or two waveform ng ating sine. Okay? So, this, we can call this one 2 hertz. Let's say, for example, yung time natin is second. Kasi, di ba, hertz is cycles per second? Oh. So, ilang cycle, this is 1 second. Ilang cycle ng ating sinusoidal wave meron sa first? 1. Di ba? Isang cycle lang to. So, we have 1 over 1 is 1. So, we have 1 hertz to. The frequency of the signal is 1 hertz. On this side, still you have 1 second. So, ilang cycle siya per second on 1 second? So, we have 1 and another 1, 2. So, we have 2 over 3 cycles per, sorry, we have 2 over 1 cycles per second, or that is 2 hertz. Okay, that is your frequency. Anyways, that is just a review. Next is you have your wavelength. So wavelength is the distance occupied by one cycle of a wave and is usually expressed in terms of meter. Okay, so yun lang yung distance mo ng isang cycle ng iyong wave. And this is just like andito sa ating spectrum. This is in terms of meter. Alright? So say for example, um this is our wave and we know that this is sinusoidal. So say for example, and repetitive siya. So itong pattern na to paulit-ulit. So this is one cycle. Tama po ba? So yung na-occupy distance ng ating one cycle, that is called one wavelength. Okay. Just like here. So pwede niya tong cycle din kasi yung ating signal pwede na paulit-ulit siya na ganitong pattern, crest to crest. Okay? So, still, yung distance natin from here to here is called one wavelength. So, basta one wavelength is, or wavelength is just the distance occupied by one cycle of a wave. Okay? So, wavelength is also the distance traveled by an electromagnetic wave during the time of one cycle. Of course, because one cycle, one cycle nga. So, wavelength din siya. So, the wavelength of a signal is expressed in terms of lambda. Okay? Yung ating frequency is F. This one is for lambda. So, this is your wavelength. This is one cycle. Okay? And since one cycle to, this also mean na ito din yung kaniyang wavelength. Okay? For this one, isang cycle din to. So, pwede din naman siyang wavelength niya. Let's look at the frequency. So, say for example, this is 1 second. Halimbawa lang ha, 1 second to. So, meron siyang isang cycle. So, 1 hertz yan. Say for example, 1 second din to. So, meron siyang 1, 2. So, 2 hertz din yan. Okay? That is your frequency and your wavelength. Review lang yan. Take note. So, since all these wave that we're talking about are those that radiates into free space, so they have something to do with the speed of light. So, yung wavelength natin is meron siyang formula na speed of light, speed of light divided by the frequency. Okay? This is the formula of our wavelength. Lambda is equal to, and speed of light is already given. That is, since wavelength is in terms of meters, so we have to get the speed of light in terms of meter. And our speed of light is 3 times 10 to the power of 8 meters. Just remember that. Okay. So, divided by, of course, your frequency. So, para bang meron ka ditong meter per second per hertz. Example. So, kumbaga, pag given na yung isang frequency, frequency, we can already solve its wavelength. Matic na, masasolve natin. Because automatic naman, constant naman itong ating 3 times 10 to the power of 8, diba? So, kapag kasi, for example, meron kang 4 megahertz na wavelength, na frequency, yung wavelength niya is 3 times 10 to the power of 8 divided by 4 mega, which gives you 73 meters. So, ano ibig sabihin nito? Na ito pala signal nito, na itong 4 megahertz, yung isang cycle niya, kasing haba ng, or may haba na 75 meters. Grabe, no? Isang ano pa lang yun, positive and negative alteration. 7 meters na. Grabe yung ano ng ating lambda ng ating signal. Okay? Ayan, so andito lang yung full names ng ating electromagnetic spectrum. So extremely low frequency, that's ELF, from 3 to 300. Dagdagan mo lang ng isang zero. May pattern to. So your voice frequency, your VF is from 300 to 3000. Again, dagdagan mo lang ng zero. Very low frequency is about 20 kilohertz. Okay. Include the higher end of the human hearing range up to 20 kilohertz. Yung low frequency mo ay 30 to 300 kilohertz. Medium frequency, ito. Okay, just read this one. And make sure to master this one. We'll have quiz regard specifically on the electromagnetic spectrum. Specifically on this, kung saan yung range niya. Okay? So for our optical spectrum, yung optical spectrum natin exists directly above the millimeter waves. So, andito yung millimeter waves natin. So, above it, ibig sabihin dito, nandito yung ating optical spectrum. So there are three types of light waves. Alright? So meron tayong infrared, meron tayong visible spectrum. Dito lang yung nakikita natin. Okay? So ibig sabihin pala yung frequency na nakikita natin is just a part of our whole electromagnetic spectrum. Diba? Andito yung visible frequency and your ultraviolet. So, ito yung tinatawag natin na optical spectrum. Of course, this one is called the visible light or the visible spectrum because itong frequency na to at on this frequency, ito lang yung nakikita natin. So, yung light na nakikita mo, kasi nakikita mo siya, the fact na nakikita mo siya, it falls on this visible spectrum. Alright. So, on your optical spectrum, again optical spectrum, tatlo silang nandun. On your optical spectrum, merong three types of light waves doon. Meron kang infrared, visible, and ultraviolet. So, yung infrared mo, narinig nyo na ba to? Diba, infrared, ito yung ginagamitan ng infrared sensor. It has something to do with the heat. Tama ba? Body heat natin. So, yung infrared radiation, is produced by a physical equipment that generates heat. Okay? Including our bodies. Because our body generates heat, meron siyang, meron siyang, of course, meron siyang radiate. Nagre-radiate siya. Meron siyang, tawag doon is infrared radiation. Infrared because it generates heat. Okay, our body generates heat. So, it produces infrared radiation. And yung infrared radiation na yun, they fall again on your optical spectrum. It is one of the types of light waves. And since nire-radiate niya, di ba, sa free space, di ba sabi natin kapag ka nasa electromagnetic spectrum, it is radiating into free space. So, ayun, same is true. So, our body radiates heat on free space. So, malamang there is that certain frequency doon, and which falls under your electromagnetic spectrum. So infrared is used in astronomy, detects stars and physical bodies in the universe, especially now in our COVID pandemic, diba? Sometimes they use that to more or less detect higher heat emissions ng ating body. Ibig sabihin, mataas yung temperatura mo. Temperature scanning, diba? And so ultraviolet naman is not somehow used in communication, but it is used primarily in medical purposes. Next is we have the term bandwidth. So kapag ka na-relate siya sa electromagnetic spectrum, bandwidth yung tawag natin doon sa portion or sa band, yeah, sa portion na na-occupy ng ating signal. Okay? Yun yung bandwidth. Kapag pagdating naman sa communication, okay, or yung channel bandwidth, this refers to the range of frequencies required to transmit the desired information. Okay? Kasi sometimes yung isang information, it requires, meron siyang range of bandwidth na kailangan para matransmit siya. Okay? So, yeah, pagdating sa communication, you call that a channel bandwidth. And of course, I'm gonna give you assignment regarding bandwidth. Okay, and we have here the remaining of our PDF. You just go over it and read. Anyways, they are now self-explanatory since I've explained the upper part na. So you should be able to understand all of this. Okay, and that ends our video lecture for chapter 1, part 2. Bye! Meron tayong mga infrared, meron tayong mga infrared cameras that could detect fever. No? Very useful. Alright, so sa taas ng ating infrared, meron tayong visible spectrum, or ito na yung tinatawag natin na light. Okay? So nakikita natin na light which comes in different colors, diba? So that is called the visible spectrum. So actually, yung colors na nakikita natin sa light is or depends on the frequency. Okay? So yung mga low frequency pala na light, they tend to be red. Okay? Low frequency. But the lower the frequency, take note tayo, and I hope you appreciate the longer the wavelength nun. Okay? Kasi ano yan eh, magkabaliktaran yan sila. Pagka low frequency ka, mas mahaba yung iyong wavelength. Violet, this is a high frequency light. Okay, yung violet pala is high frequency light. Meron din tayong light waves. Light waves of very high frequency enables them to handle tremendous amount of information. The bandwidth of the baseband signals can be very wide. And ano yun ba yun? Sunset, somehow yung sunset natin is medyo reddish siya, di ba? Kasi yung red na color ng light, or yung red light, yun usually yung merong mas mahabang wavelength. Tama ba? So, kasi daw mas mahaba siya, mas umaabot siya dun sa, mas nakikita siya sa sunset. Kasi it's the longer siya na wavelength. So, ayan, meron tayo ditong reason kung bakit yung sunrise and sunset maganda. Medyo reddish siya. Okay? So, during sunrise and sunset daw, when the sun's light has to travel farthest to reach the observer, kasi medyo mas malayo na yung sun during that time, di ba? Sunrise and sunset. The particles in the sky scatter light with shorter wavelengths. So, yung mga lights na shorter lang yung wavelength, just like violet, blue, and green, hindi sila umaabot sa'yo on your eyes. So, they just tend to scatter. But, light with longer wavelength, just like red, yung na-mention ko kanina, and orange and yellow, has a better chance of making it pass through the airborne particles. Mas nakaka-pass through sila dito sa particles na ito, and thus they are able to reach your eyes kasi they have longer wavelength. So kaya more or less yung nakikita mo sa sun, although same pa rin naman yung radiation ng sun, yung light na nai-emit niya, but yung maabot lang sa'yo is yung more or less these colors, itong red, orange, and yellow. Kaya kung nakikita mo yung sunset, parang combination na lang siya ng red, orange, yellow, di ba? So these are lights with longer wavelengths. Ayan, so we have here our wavelength in nanometers for our colors. So for violet, andito, mas mababa siya yung wavelength niya kumpara dito sa from lowest to highest. Okay, so pinakamataas na wavelength yung red, orange, tsaka yellow. So these colors, the violet, blue, cyan, and green, medyo shorter yung wavelength niya kumpara dito. Kaya pagdating ng sunset, more like ganitong combinations ng color na lang yung nakikita mo. Okay? Kapag ka, ano naman, like hindi sunset, like noon, more or less it's the presence of all of this. So, para bang as if white yung nakikita mo. Ayun. So, kapag ka, ayun, white nga yung ating light, as if it appears white kasi present yung lahat ng color natin.